That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Charmed Life by Diana Wynne Jones, chapters 1 through 4, brought to you by Patricia. In these chapters, I get introduced to a new world, parallel to ours, according to Wynne Jones, in which magic is very common, but not necessarily looked upon favorably by everybody. And there is a couple of children here who could not be more different from one another. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. So this book starts off really strong. And, you know, it's always kind of a crapshoot when you start a new book, how much it's going to grab you right out of the gate and how much it's going to, like, for example, if I'm reading for Spoil Me a lot of the time, I have to be aware of how long it's going to take to read because I oftentimes wait to read until just before I record. I try and watch TV shows more than once because I will miss things if I'm focusing on one part of the scene versus another. That kind of thing doesn't happen when I'm reading quite the same way. So I will just read the once. But this is one of those times where I flew through the chapters that I was meant to read, and definitely, like, even though it took me an hour to read, kind of was like, oh, once I got to the end of chapter 4. And the end of chapter 4, I'm at 60 pages, and I'm only supposed to really read 50. So I was really over my time already, but I still wanted to keep going. I'm going to read you all the note from the beginning of this book. It's not long. There are thousands of worlds, all different from ours. Chrestomanci's world is the one next door to us, and the difference here is that magic is as common as music is with us. It is full of people working magic, warlocks, witches, thaumaturges, sorcerers, fakers, conjurers, hexers, magicians, mages, shamans, diviners, and many more. Is it diviners or diviners? From the lowest certified witch right up to the most powerful of enchanters. Enchanters are strange as well as powerful. Their magic is different and stronger, and many of them have more than one life, which is like, what? Now, if someone did not control all these busy magic users, ordinary people would have a horrible time and probably end up as slaves. So the government appoints the very strongest enchanter there is to make sure no one misuses magic. This enchanter has 9 lives and is known as the Chrestomanci. You pronounce it Chrestomanci. He has to have a strong personality as well as strong magic. So basically, there's like one person who's like the equivalent of the White Council in Dresden Files, which that's a lot of power for one person to have. Also, it's one person like worldwide. It's not even necessarily a I was thinking that it might be like a country to country thing, but like this is the guy, right? So I'm going to talk about my theories here in a little bit. I'm going to do that at the end, I think. I want to get to talking about Kat and Gwen. First of all, Kat is not magical as far as we know. Kat's sister Gwen is. Her name is Gwendolyn, and she's called Gwendolyn all the time, which I feel like has to be on purpose because it's reminding me so much of Gwendolyn the Good Witch. It's Glinda the Good Witch, isn't it? So I just kind of associated that. But I'm going to call her Gwen for the sake of brevity. And things start off with Kat noticing that his sister probably has some magic and his parents like not really wanting to talk about it and not being pleased, it doesn't seem. And eventually they go out on a boat ride together for the day, something that is supposed to be a lovely day out. And I want to read you guys this because I feel like this is one of the most effectively written paragraph summaries of a terrible accident that I've read. It conjures this image of the very mundane alongside the really terrible, and does it so quickly and succinctly that you feel like you understand completely right away. Let's see. They set out in great style. It was a hot day. The steamer was crammed with other people in holiday clothes, talking, laughing, eating whelks with thin slices of white bread and butter, while the paddleboat steam organ wheezed out popular tunes so that no one could hear themselves talk. And it goes on to talk about, like, the steamer was too crowded and too old, and they wound up hitting something, it broke into pieces, and it says, they hit one of the posts, which were supposed to stop people from being swept away, and the paddle steamer, being old, simply broke into pieces. Kat remembered the organ playing and the paddles beating the blue sky. Clouds of steam screamed from broken pipes and drowned the screams of the crowd as every single person aboard was swept away through the dam. It was a terrible accident. The papers called it the Saucy Nancy disaster. The ladies in their clinging skirts were quite unable to swim. The men in tight blue serge were very little better off. But Gwendolen was a witch, so she could not drown, and Kat, who flung his arms around Gwendolen when the boat hit the post, survived too. There were very few other survivors. So yeah, just like a really like, just describing the way it started out and how happy it was, the simplicity with which she describes exactly how the boat broke, and the kind of, there's something really haunting and effective about just saying, like, they were playing a steam organ, and then when that broke, it just screamed steam, and that mixed with the actual screams of people. It's just really, like, upsetting, you know? I just thought that was so well done. They became celebrities for a time. Everyone was very kind. Everyone said what beautiful little orphans they were. And it was true. They were both fair and pale, with blue eyes, and looked good in black. Gwendolen was very pretty, and tall for her age. Kat was small for his age. Gwendolen was very motherly to Kat, and people were touched. Kat did not mind. It made up a little for the empty, lost way he was feeling. Ladies gave him cake and toys. Town councilors came and asked how he was getting on, and the mayor called and patted him on the head. The mayor explained that the money from the fund was being put into a trust for them until they were grown up. Meanwhile, the town would pay for their education and upbringing. "And where would you little people like to live?" he asked kindly. Gwendolen at once said that old Mrs. Sharp downstairs had offered to take them in. "She's been ever so kind to us," she explained. "We'd love to live with her." Mrs. Sharp had been very kind. She was a witch, too. The printed sign in her parlor window said certified witch, and interested in Gwendolen. The mayor was a little dubious. Like all people who had no talent for witchcraft, he did not approve of those who had. He asked Kat how he felt about Gwendolen's plan. Kat did not mind. He preferred living in the house he was used to, even if it was downstairs. Since the mayor felt that the two orphans ought to be made as happy as possible, he agreed. Gwendolen and Kat moved in with Mrs. Sharp. So what we wind up finding out, and I'm going to summarize some of this here. Mrs. Sharp, even though it says certified witch, so the fact that it says certified witch in her window, despite, like, you know, what it said in the note at the beginning of the book, it reaffirms that magic is something that everybody knows about and is used to and is willing to advertise. Even as much as this mayor doesn't approve of it, it's, you know, a commonly accepted thing. And we find out, though, that certified witch is like a really base level competence, like, what's the word I want to say? Qualifier? It's essentially being like a restaurant that just posts that it got a C on its, like, health code check. Basically, I can serve you food and I will not make you sick. Bare minimum, you know? So Gwen, it turns out, has, like, a lot of talent, like, much more than Kat had any inkling of. And I find it really interesting that Kat's parents, aren't really excited about it, because, you know, it's one thing to say, like, all people who don't have magical talent. He's suspicious of people who do regarding the mayor. But the way it's talked about later, it feels like Kat's father, Gwen's also father, might have had talent of his own from the fact that he like knew about the Chrestomanci and like got into an argument with him. So I feel like they didn't necessarily disapprove because they disapproved of magic, that maybe there was something else going on there. So we must see about a teacher for you right away. You could do worse than going to Mr. Nostrum next door for a start. He may be the worst necromancer in town, but he knows how to teach. He'll give you a good grounding, my love. So the paying of a teacher for magic is not something that the town is going to support. They will pay for Gwendolyn to go to regular school, but they are not going to pay Nostrum to teach her magic, which Mrs. Sharp is very irritated by. She feels like it's bigoted, and she's trying to figure out a way to pay for it. And she winds up getting a box of their parents' things given to her, which, you know, it's sort of a weird, like, this is the sort of thing that I'm always very curious about. When you read these sorts of books, it's just such a thing in especially British children's literature, but a lot of children's literature in general. We're going to get rid of the parents somehow. Either your parents are sending you away because there's disease and they're sending you to the country out of the city, or you are in boarding school, or your parents are dead, right? I find it interesting here that we're kind of brought along for the ride in terms of the story telling us step by step how their parents died right from the beginning, instead of it being like, by the time we reach these two characters, that they've been parentless for years and they're just sort of like used to it. This is an immediate, like right after the accident kind of start to the story. But we don't actually find out who handled and how they handled their old home. So somehow Mrs. Sharp is the one that's like given, and you know, it makes sense because she's their guardian, but she's just given a box of their stuff. And I just do want to be like, well, what happened to everything else? What happened to all the furniture in the house? What about, like, did they not let the kids go through things and decide what they wanted to keep out of everything? But apparently not. So she dumps this out and she finds these this one pair of really beautiful diamond earrings. And there is an implication, and it's not said, but there's an implication that she's planning to pawn them and use some of the money to pay for the magical education, but she definitely hold on to the rest of the money. And Gwendolyn kind of steps forward and they fight like magically in a very subtle, low-key way to grab each of them to grab the earrings first. Gwen winds up winning, and it's clear that Mrs. Sharp is a little like aggrieved that Gwen is able to beat her so quickly when she hasn't had any schooling or anything yet. But she's also, it seems, banking on the fact that Gwen is going to become very successful and famous as a witch, and that maybe if she treats Gwen well enough, she'll be able to come along for the ride. Because, understandably, Mrs. Sharp is very worried about, like, how she's going to live as an older woman who isn't particularly a good witch, and so she doesn't get very much business. She gets business because she, like, charges less than practically anyone else because the quality of her spells and stuff are not very good. So, it's an interesting moment because, like, of course, when there's an old woman who's taking in these kids, it's really tempting for me to be immediately like, oh, that is really sweet and kind of her. And she's talked about as if she's very kind. But you still do get leaking through these little bits of real humanity from her. Like, we find out later that she tells the town that Gwen is taking music classes and then is just pocketing the money that they're sending to pay for those music classes instead of, you know. And Cat has sort of mixed feelings on this. Like, once he figures out what's going on, a part of him is just like, well, that's just stealing. And Mrs. Sharp is like, listen, I'm not getting anything to, like, help the two of you out and keep you here. And I do have to, like, it costs to, like, feed you. And I also need to worry about what's going to happen to me in the end. Like, I need to put by some money so that I can, like, stay alive in my old age when I'm not able to work at all anymore. And he does kind of, like, give that to her. He's still side-eyeing her a little bit, but he sees the sense in it and doesn't really try and, like, hold it against her. But that is not to say that she isn't just greedy sometimes as well. And I have a really hard time faulting somebody who, I won't say is impoverished, because it doesn't feel like that's true, but somebody who is of a lower class and especially not very talented. I don't like to hold it against them that they're sort of greedy, because there is a part of me that just is like, I have always been so worried about money. And it's just something that will be with me my whole life, I feel like, that I can't help but, like, understand and give a pass. She's not taking things so far that she's, like, harming the children. And she's not, I don't feel like she's hurting anybody. And that's really what it comes down to for me. But yeah, so I found the way that Mrs. Sharp is described as being really interesting. So yeah, your mom must have had money now if I took those to Mr. Nostrum, but we'd get more for them if I took them around to Mr. Larkin's. And so this is what they fight. You have a real talent, dearie. And then she finds some letters, and a bunch of them are love letters, business letters, yada, yada, yada. But then she pulls out 3 other letters. Chrestomanci, she exclaimed. And as soon as she said it, she clapped one hand over her mouth and mumbled behind it. Her face was red. Kat could see she was surprised, frightened, and greedy all at the same time. Now, what was he doing writing to your pa? She said, as soon as she had recovered. Let's see, said Gwendolen. Mrs. Sharp spread the 3 letters out on the kitchen table, and Gwendolen and Kat bent over them. The first thing that struck Kat was the energy of the signature on all 3. The next thing he saw was that 2 of the letters were written in the same energetic handwriting as the signature. The first was dated 12 years ago, soon after his parents had been married. It said, Dear Frank, now don't get on your high horse. I only offered because I thought it might help. I still will help in any way I can if you let me know what I can do. I feel you have a claim on me. Yours ever, Chrestomanci. The second letter was shorter. Dear Chant, the same to you. Go to blazes. Chrestomanci. The third letter was dated 6 years ago, and it was written by someone else. Chrestomanci had only signed it. Sir, you were warned 6 years ago that something like what you relate might come to pass, and you made it quite clear that you wished for no help from this quarter. We are not interested in your troubles, nor is this a charitable institution. Chrestomanci. What did your pa say to him? Mrs. Sharp wondered. Well, what do you think, dearie? Gwendolen held her hands spread out above the letters, rather as if she was warming them at a fire. Both her little fingers twitched. I don't know. They feel important, especially the first one and the last one. Awfully important. Who's Chrestomanci? Kat asked. It was a hard name to say. He said it in pieces, trying to remember the way Mrs. Sharp had said it. Never you mind who he is, my love. And important's a weak word for it, dearie. I wish I knew what your pa had said. Something not many people dare say by the sound of it. And look what he got in return. 3 genuine signatures. Mr. Nordstrom would give his eyes for those, dearie. Oh, you're in luck. He'll teach you for those, all right. So would any necromancer in the country. And then she comes across a book of matches. And this, in particular, really, really got my attention for no good reason, but I just am dying to know because there has to be something to this. A little red book of matches had fallen out of the bundle of business letters. Mrs. Sharp took it up carefully and quite as carefully opened it. It was less than half full of flimsy cardboard matches, but 3 of the matches had been burned without being torn out of the book first. The third one along was so very burned that Kat supposed it must have set to light the other 2. Said Mrs. Sharp. I think you'd better keep this, dearie. She passed the little red book to Gwendolen, who put it in the pocket of her dress along with the earrings. And what about you having this, my love? Said Mrs. Sharp, and gave him a spray of white heather. Kat wore it in his buttonhole until it fell to pieces. So you get a lot there. First, that the Chrestomanci is very important, that his signatures are somehow worth something, that Gwen can sense what they're worth by putting her hands over them, although she's still like very much an amateur. She hasn't even started classes here yet. And that Cat is just sort of like seen a little bit as an afterthought. And that's not to say that like he's neglected, because obviously Mrs. Sharp tries to pay just as much attention to him. But there's no denying that Gwen is the preferred of the two. She's the one with the talent. She's the one with the really like bold, good looks, the personality that's very confident and attention getting. And Cat just doesn't really have any of that. And without having any magical talent as well, it's just sort of like, he's just a lot more underwhelming, you know? And I don't say that to throw shade, but I feel like he would really agree. So the fact that, you know, Gwen gets like this book of matches and these diamond earrings, and all he gets is a spray of heather that like literally crumbles apart, feels pretty much like a pattern already starting for him in his life. Living with Mrs. Sharp, Gwendolen seemed to expand. Her hair seemed brighter gold, her eyes deeper blue, and her whole manner was glad and confident. Perhaps Cat contracted a little to make room for her. He did not know. Not that he was unhappy. Mrs. Sharp was quite as kind to him as she was to Gwendolen. Town councilors and their wives called several times a week and patted him on the head in the parlor. So we get a little, you know, just overview of what things are like for him. And he has friends. It's not like he doesn't have any. But he doesn't feel like close to them. And the fact of not having his parents, I think, makes him lonelier than Gwen feels. She's just not really... And you know, I think there is a hope in his heart that the fact that they both don't have their parents will draw him and Gwen together, because that's how it started off. Like, it was, you know, she was described as being very like maternal to him initially, and that he kind of liked that. But as time goes on and she becomes better at magic and feels like more distanced from him, he's of course going to feel a little bit abandoned, and I don't blame him for that. Gwendolen made excellent progress. Such a promising witch was she, indeed, that she skipped the first grade magic exam and went straight on to the second. She took the third and fourth grades together just after Christmas, and by the following summer she was starting on advanced magic. Mr. Nostrum regarded her as his favorite pupil. He told Mrs. Sharp so over the wall, and Gwendolen always came back from her lessons with him, pleased and golden and glowing. So yeah, things are really going quite well for her. And then we find out, so, okay. There's a moment where Cat is trying to learn how to play the violin. And he sort of thinks that he's like not too terrible at it, but it seems like other people don't really agree. And at one point, Gwen comes in a fucking fury because he's just been bothering her, apparently, but he does not realize it. And she turns the violin into a cat. And they never turn it back. They never do. And the cat just becomes like this neighborhood cat, even though it's not friendly at all. But it's still something that's like like kind of a curiosity and evidence of how good she is at magic. Apparently, like, transfiguring a violin into a cat is a pretty big deal. And people find it very impressive. But, you know, it's like a really mean little thing that she's doing. She's like being mean to her brother. She's like taking something away from him. It's a really big character moment, I feel like. I don't know. It was the first moment for me that I really wasn't feeling Gwendolen. And it only really gets worse from there. Let's see. The various witches were always looking out simple spells for her. Gwendolen was very scornful of these spells. "Did they think I'm a baby or something? I'm miles beyond this stuff," she would say, casting the latest spell aside. Mrs. Sharp, who was glad of any aid to witchcraft, usually gathered the spell up carefully and hid it. But once or twice Cat found the odd spell lying about. Then he could not resist trying it. He would have liked to have had just a little of Gwendolyn's talent. He had always hoped that he was a late developer and that someday a spell would work for him. But they never did. Not even the one for turning brass buttons to gold, which Kat particularly fancied. The various fortune tellers gave Gwendolyn presents too. She got an old crystal ball from the diviner and a pack of cards from the soothsayer. The fortune teller told her fortune for her. Gwendolyn came in golden and exultant from that. "I'm going to be famous. He said I could rule the world if I go the right way about it," she told Kat. Though Kat had no doubt that Gwendolyn would be famous, he could not see how she could rule the world, and he said so. "You'd only rule one country, even if you married the king," he objected, "and the Prince of Wales got married last year." "There are more ways of ruling than that, stupid," Gwendolyn retorted. "Mr. Nostrum has lots of ideas for me for a start. Mind you, there are some snags. There's a change for the worse that I have to surmount, and a dominant dark stranger. But when he told me I'd rule the world, my fingers all twitched, so I know it's true." There seemed no limit to Gwendolyn's glowing confidence. The next day, Miss Larkins the clairvoyant called Kat into her house and offered to tell his fortune too. Now, Kat is not interested in hearing his fortune, and he does not like the way that Miss Larkins is so aggressive about it, and tries to avoid this, but she really basically sort of pins him down. And when she does, a voice comes out, and apparently she's used to fortune telling in different voices, but this one, when he describes it to her later, is not familiar to her, and it doesn't seem familiar to him either. It was a man's voice, brisk and kindly. "You've taken a weight off my mind, lad," it said. It sounded pleased. "There'll be a big change coming up for you now. But you've been awfully careless. 4 gone already and only 5 left. You must take more care. You're in danger from at least 2 directions. Did you know?" The voice stopped. By this time, Kat was so frightened that he dared not move. So, yeah, when he reports to Miss Larkin, she's asking, "Well, did I say anything about your sister?" Even though she's telling his fortune, it still all revolves around Gwendolyn. I just really felt for him in that moment. And when he says no, she's like, "Oh, well, all right." She's so disappointed. So let's see. Oh, yeah. Then Mr. Nostrum runs into Kat with his brother, William. Mr. Nostrum's brother... Mr. Nostrum himself has 1 lazy eye, and his brother has 2 lazy eyes. And the way that this is described is so uncomfortable. Kat getting caught out by himself on the pavement with these 2 dudes. They're both wizards. And Mr. Williams is kind of morose, or Mr. William. "The fact is, young Chant, we've met with a little setback. My brother is upset. It's about those letters from you-know-who. We can find out nothing. It seems Gwendolyn knows nothing. Do you, young Chant, perchance know why your esteemed and lamented father should be acquainted with, let us just call him, the august personage who signed them?" "I haven't the faintest, I'm afraid," said Kat. "Could he have been some relation?" suggested Mr. Henry Nostrum. "Chant is a good name, and good name is capitalized. So I want to know what that is about." And Kat, when he says, they ask, "Well, what was your mother's maiden name?" Kat says it's on their marriage lines. She was called Chant too. What's that about? What is that, guys? Are they brother and sister pretending to be husband and wife, raising these kids that are really her children by another man? That's all I can think, is that they weren't married. I don't know. I'm just, because I'm are they the Chrestomanci's children? I mean, I don't know how this works. So let's see. Why don't you write and ask Mr. The august personage? It will serve, Henry. It will serve. So yeah, they wind up walking off, and, let's see. "That was a good idea of yours of writing to Chrestomanci," she said to Kat. "I can't think why I didn't think of it. Anyway, I just have." "Why did you do it? Couldn't Mr. Nostrum?" "It came more naturally from me," said Gwendolyn, "and I suppose it doesn't matter if he gets my signature. Mr. Nostrum told me what to write." "What does he want to know, anyway?" Kat said. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Gwendolyn said exultingly. "No," said Kat, "I wouldn't." Which I kind of enjoy, that Kat is just kind of like, I really don't want anything to do with any of this. I just have to take an aside here, because we get this moment. He's like thinking to himself about how he's gotten some apples from the neighbors. He's like stolen them. And Mrs. Sharp loves apples so much, and sometimes wants to reward him by making gingerbread men. As a rule, gingerbread men were fun. They leaped off the plate and ran when you tried to eat them, so that when you finally caught them, you felt quite justified in eating them. It was a fair fight, and some got away. But Mrs. Sharp's gingerbread men never did that. They simply lay feebly waving their arms, and Kat never had the heart to eat them. And that's so pathetic and sad and terrible. And later on, when the Chrestomanci comes over and he is offered some gingerbread men, he also does not seem to have the heart to eat them. He doesn't touch them, and I'm just like, oh, this is so sad. So yeah, he comes home one day, and this like obviously very imposing man is standing in the kitchen, and the kitchen is kind of a disaster. There's like meat left out that's going to be for dinner, and there are like flies starting to gather around it, and the dough for gingerbread men is already out and like just like laying across. It's just kind of a mess. They have this weird kind of meeting. Mr. Chrestomanci? Just Chrestomanci, said the stranger. Yes, would you be Gwendolen? Yes, Mr. Nostrum told me there was a cab here, gasped Gwendolen. She was followed by Mrs. Sharp, nearly as breathless. The two of them took over the conversation, and Kat was thankful for it. Chrestomanci at last consented to be taken to the parlor, where Mrs. Sharp deferentially offered him a cup of tea and a plate of her weekly waving gingerbread men. Chrestomanci, Kat was interested to see, did not seem to have the heart to eat them either. He drank a cup of tea, austerely, without milk or sugar, and asked questions about how Gwendolen and Kat came to be living with Mrs. Sharp. Mrs. Sharp tried to give the impression that she looked after them for nothing, out of the goodness of her heart. She hoped Chrestomanci might be induced to pay her for their keep, as well as the town council, but Gwendolen had decided to be radiantly honest. The town pays, she said, because everyone's so sorry about the accident. Kat was glad she had explained, even though he suspected that Gwendolen might already be casting Mrs. Sharp off like an old coat. Then I must go and speak to the mayor, Chrestomanci said, and he stood up, dusting his splendid hat on his elegant sleeve. Mrs. Sharp sighed and sagged. She knew what Gwendolen was doing, too. I kind of feel for her, you know, like, I don't like her trying to, like, weasel more money out of this guy, but I think really what it comes down to is that in the end, she has done so right by these kids and doesn't mistreat them in any way, and I don't like Gwen. So part of me is like, she just should get more money because Gwen is just insufferable, honestly. He went away in his cab, leaving Mrs. Sharp very sour, Gwendolen jubilant, and Kat nervous. Why are you so happy? Because he was touched at our orphaned state. He's going to adopt us. My fortune is made. Don't talk such nonsense, snapped Mrs. Sharp. Your fortune is the same as it ever was. He may have come here in all his finery, but he said nothing and he promised nothing. Gwendolen smiled confidently. You didn't see the heart-wringing letter I wrote. Maybe, but he's got no heart to wring. Kat rather agreed with Mrs. Sharp, particularly as he had an uneasy feeling that before Gwendolen and Mrs. Sharp arrived, he had somehow managed to offend Chrestomanci as badly as his father once did. He hoped Gwendolen would not realize that. But to his astonishment, Gwendolen proved to be right. The mayor called that afternoon and told them that Chrestomanci had arranged for Kat and Gwendolen to come live with him as part of his own family. And I see I needn't tell you what lucky little people you are, he said, as Gwendolen uttered a shriek of joy and hugged the dour Mrs. Sharp. Okay. They wind up going over there. This place looks amazing, right? And Gwen is really feeling herself. Obviously, in her mind, Kat is a complete non-factor. Kat's lucky to be coming along for the ride because she is clearly the one who got them adopted, and they owe all of their incredible change in circumstances to her, according to her, which at this point appears to be true. And it's just such a weird thing because, like, she wants to be treated with so much more pomp and circumstance than she's getting. But when she does get little tidbits, it's significant. So, like, they get greeted at the train station and are, you know, called for by name, which she feels very important about. But then when she says, like, oh, that's us, and expects somebody to be like, well, we're so happy to have you, they're just like, oh, okay, that's you, cool. And they go and get their bags, and there's, like, not a big to-do about it, and she's kind of bent out of shape. But then they go to, like, get in a cab, and it turns out to be an actual car rather than a horse and carriage. And again, she's like, well, that's only what we deserve, of course. And gets happy again. They come around the corner, and they see this amazing castle, and her initial reaction is, oh shit, an amazing castle. This is exactly where we should be living. Like, perfect. But then the car pulls around to the side so that she has to go in through a back door instead of through the main doors where she imagines the servants would be welcoming them with, again, pomp and circumstance. And going in through the side door and being greeted by a housekeeper she feels is very beneath what they deserve. It's such a strange little series of ups and downs that as a reader, I still don't really feel like I understand exactly where she stands and what I expected. Like, I guess I did expect them to be brought through the front door, but it seems like the Chrestomanci left instructions for the two of them to be treated as if they were just family, and not family of like a noble either. Family of just somebody who owns the house, you know? And I think that's the thing when he says that he wants them to live with him as family, that she has an idea in her head of what that looks like, of what how his family is probably treated. And it does not seem like that's true. And they're brought to their two separate rooms. And hers is this really big, very luxurious room with an attached bathroom, and it's beautiful. His room is much simpler, whitewashed, and, you know, but it also sounds simply beautiful. It's in the older part of the castle, whereas her room is in, like, the newer part. And it seems like they really have had quite a stroke of luck. Like, this is a beautiful place, the grounds are amazing, there are servants, yada yada yada. But then they're told, oh well, we'll have tea for you and you can join us for tea, or you can have tea in your rooms. And he goes down to have tea with Gwendolyn in her room, and the tea is really, like, underwhelming. It's just boring plain biscuits and, like, bread and butter, and there's not even, like, jam for the bread or anything. And they're both just kind of like, how is that possible? This place is amazing and there are plenty of servants, and yet this food is nothing. And I, like, have to admit that, and I say this all the time, I love food. I love cooking. And of course, as a reader, and they pull up to this amazing place, I'm assuming that they are going to get some amazing food, that there's going to be these spreads for dinner. And, you know, when they wind up having dinner with the family and dress formally, that is indeed what happens. They have this big fancy dinner, but it's not like the food isn't even really the focus there. It's more their manners and their conversation that seems to be the focus. And that all makes Cat very uncomfortable. He doesn't have any interest in any of that. And when they have breakfast the next day, the breakfast is literally like bread and butter and hot cocoa. And they were just like, you know, they're kind of, I think, thinking to themselves, like, oh, we used to have better breakfasts with Mrs. Sharp. We're in a cat. What the fuck? And the maid, who is supposed to be, like, kind of in charge of keeping an eye on them and feeding them, seems really put out at the fact that they are expecting more than they're getting. And it's such a strange situation because I don't feel like their expectations are out of line at all. And I also don't feel like this, like, of course, the way that this maid is reacting is strange to me, that she's being, like, so surly about it. And I can't help but wonder is like, I wanted to think at first, because this is like someplace that's got a lot of magic, maybe this is food that is actually enchanted to look boring, but is something else if you're good enough at magic to be able to see it. And that kind of gets like kiboshed at breakfast when they're like, well, can we at least have some marmalade? And even the housekeeper is like, hold on. And then the kids say, we're not allowed to have marmalade. Like, they're all agreeing on what the food is and what they're seeing. So, and they talk it over in very plain terms by that point. So my ideas on what was going on here kind of got shot all to hell. So yeah, I'm just not really sure what to think here. Let's see. I'm trying to find... Oh, yeah, your room is up here, Eric. I keep forgetting that Kat's name is actually Eric. He looked around the room itself. The curved walls were whitewashed, and so was the thick fireplace. The bed had a patchwork quilt on it. There was a table, a chest of drawers, and a bookcase with interesting-looking books in it. Oh, I like this, he said to Miss Bessemer. I'm afraid your bathroom is down the passage, said Miss Bessemer, as if this was a drawback. But as Kat had never had a private bathroom before, he did not mind in the least. So let's see. Then he goes and sees his sister, and they're kind of underwhelmed by the food. But then her room was certainly luxurious. The wallpaper seemed to be made of blue velvet. The top and bottom of the bed was upholstered like a chair in blue velvet with buttons in it, and the blue velvet bedspread matched exactly. The chairs were painted gold. There was a dressing table fit for a princess, with little golden drawers, gold-backed brushes, and a long oval mirror surrounded by a gilded wreath. Gwendolen admitted that she liked the dressing table, though she was not so sure about the wardrobe, which had painted garlands and maypole dancers on it. It's to hang clothes in, not to look at, she said. It distracts me, but the bathroom is lovely. The bathroom was tiled with blue and white tiles, and the bath was sunk down into the tiled floor. Over it, draped like a baby's cradle, were blue curtains for when you wanted a shower. The towels matched the tiles. Kat preferred his own bathroom, but that may have been because he had to spend rather a long time in Gwendolen's. Gwendolen locked him in it while she unpacked. And she doesn't let the servant unpack either because she's just like trying to hide stuff that she's got in her bag, which I'm just like, what do you have in there? I don't think the servants here are very civil, she said. If that girl says one thing more, she'll find herself with a boil on her nose. And he is also surprised that she doesn't want to dress up for dinner because he thought that that would be the sort of thing that she's excited about. And she says really that the problem is that it just doesn't seem natural. But when she stops and thinks about it, she is kind of excited about dressing up. So there's this like gong that sounds to alert them that dinner will start in half an hour and that they need to get changed. And they head down there, and there was an old lady in lace mittens and a small man with large eyebrows and a loud voice who was talking about stocks and shares. Mr. Saunders, whose wrists and ankles were too long for his shiny black suit, and at least 2 younger ladies, and at least 2 younger men. Kat saw Chrestomanci quite splendid in very dark red velvet, and Chrestomanci saw Kat and Gwendolen and looked at them with a vague, perplexed smile, which made Kat quite sure that Chrestomanci had forgotten who they were. What? How? How are they that much of an afterthought that he doesn't even remember that they're here? What a weird situation. I don't know what to make of this guy. Like, he's always dressed at the top of fashion, but he doesn't seem to, like, have any presence of mind at all. They were ushered in front of a plump lady with a mild face. She had a gorgeous lace dress on. Gwendolen's eyes swept up and down it with considerable awe, but otherwise she was one of the most ordinary ladies they had ever seen. She gave them a friendly smile. Eric and Gwendolen, isn't it? You must call me Millie, my dears. And now you must meet my Julia and my Roger. 2 plump children came and stood beside her. They were both rather pale and had a tendency to breathe heavily. The girl wore a lace dress like her mother's, and the boy had on a blue velvet suit, but no clothes could disguise the fact that they were even more ordinary looking than their mother. They looked politely at Gwendolen and at Kat, and all 4 said, "How do you do?" Then there seemed nothing else to say. And here comes this moment. And again, just little nails in Gwen's coffin in terms of me ever liking her. Luckily, they had not stood there long before a butler came and opened the double doors at the end of the room and told them that dinner was served. Gwendolen looked at this butler in great indignation. "Why didn't he open the door to us?" she whispered to Kat as they all went in a ragged sort of procession to the dining room. "Why are we fobbed off with the housekeeper?" Girl, you need to fucking chill. So we have dinner, and poor Kat, he doesn't like being surprised by the footman coming up behind him with the food, like, over his shoulder. He's supposed to serve himself, but he doesn't know, like, how much he's supposed to take. And also, he's left-handed, so the fact that they keep coming at him from the right side makes it really difficult for him to take things off of the trays, and he keeps spilling things. He tried changing them over and dropped a spoon. He tried leaving them as they were and spilled gravy. The footman always said, "Not to worry, sir," and made him feel worse than ever. So then they start talking about art and Europe and all of this stuff. And they're all obviously very into this conversation, except for Kat and Gwen. They don't really engage in this conversation at all. And he feels really bad about it. Like, he just feels like an idiot, you know, that he has nothing to contribute to this. And he doesn't really have an appetite due to this, like this anxiety, which I really can relate to. As much as I love food and I love eating, and I'll definitely eat for comfort at times, sometimes when I'm very upset, I can't even think of eating. Like, I just get this sick kind of twisted feeling in my stomach that's like one step from actual nausea. And I'm like, if I eat now, it's going to be bad. So when they finally leave, Gwen says, "What a childish trick. They were showing off just to make us feel small. Mr. Nostrum warned me they would. It's to disguise the thinness of their souls. What an awful dull wife. And did you ever see anyone so plain and stupid as those two children? I know I'm going to hate it here. This castle's crushing me already." "It may not be so bad once we get used to it," Kat said, without hope. "It'll be worse," Gwendolen promised him. "There's something about this castle. It's a bad influence, and a deadness. It's squashing the life and the witchcraft out of me. I can hardly breathe." "You're imagining things," said Kat, "because you want to be back with Mrs. Sharp." "No, I'm not imagining it. I should have thought it was strong enough even for you to feel. Go on, try. Can't you feel the deadness?" Kat did not really need to try to see what she meant. There was something strange about the castle. He had thought it was simply that it was so quiet, but it was more than that. There was a softness to the atmosphere, a weightiness, as if everything they said or did was muffled under a great feather quilt. Normal sounds like their two voices seemed thin. There were no echoes to them. "Yes, it is queer," he agreed. "It's more than queer, it's terrible," said Gwendolen. "I shall be lucky if I survive." "So, I'm not sorry I came." "I am," said Kat. "Oh, you would need looking after," said Gwendolen. "All right, there's a pack of cards on the dressing table. Such a weird thing, so I'm not sorry I came." So here, the start of the next chapter, I really like. The same softness and silence were there when the red-haired Mary woke Kat the next morning and told him it was time to get up. Bright morning sunshine was flooding the curved walls of his room. Though Kat knew now that the castle must be full of people, he could not hear a sound from any of them, nor could he hear anything from outside the windows. "I know what it's like," Kat thought. "It's like when it snowed in the night." The idea made him feel so pleased and so warm that he went to sleep again. "You really must get up, Eric," Mary said, shaking him. "I've run your bath and your lessons start at 9. Make haste or you won't have time for breakfast." Kat got up. He had so strong a feeling that it had snowed in the night that he was quite surprised to find his room warm in the sun. He looked out of the windows, and there were green lawns and flowers and rooks circling the green trees as if there had been some mistake. Mary had gone, and Kat was glad because he was not at all sure he liked her, and he was afraid of missing breakfast. So, they go to breakfast, and this is where it's all very disappointing. I love this moment where, is this all there is? "What else do you want?" asked Euphemia. Gwendolen could not find words to express what she wanted. Porridge, bacon and eggs, grapefruit, toast, and kippers all occurred to her at once, and she went on staring. "Make up your mind," Euphemia said at last. "My breakfast's waiting for me too, you know." "Isn't there any marmalade?" said Gwendolen. "Julia and Roger are not allowed marmalade," Mary said. "No one forbade me to have it," said Gwendolen. "Get me some marmalade at once." Mary went to a speaking tube by the lift, and after much rumbling and another clank, a pot of marmalade arrived. Mary brought it and put it in front of Gwendolen. "Thank you," Cat said fervently. He felt as strongly about it as Gwendolen, more in fact, because he hated cocoa. "Oh, no trouble, I'm sure," Mary said, in what was certainly a sarcastic way, and the two maids went out. What the hell, right? So, the two kids are talking about how they aren't allowed to have marmalade because they're too fat, but they're going to have it anyway. And he watches them pile so much marmalade on their bread that he's just like disgusted. Like, Cat's just like, how? And Gwen then says, "Your father is such a handsome man. It must be such a disappointment to him that you're both pudgy and plain like your mother." The two children looked at her placidly over their cliffs of marmalade. "Oh, I wouldn't know," said Roger. "Pudgy is comfortable," said Julia. "It must be a nuisance to look like a china doll the way you do." Gwendolen's blue eyes glared. She made a small sign under the edge of the table. The bread and thick marmalade whisked itself from Julia's hands and slapped itself on Julia's face, marmalade side inward. Julia gasped a little. "How dare you insult me?" said Gwendolen. After she had just fucking insulted them. So this results in Julia suspending the jug of cocoa above Gwen's head and threatening to dump the whole thing over her, which was very, very satisfying to read. I love the fact that Julia knows magic and the fact that Gwendolen did not see it coming at all. Like, the whole way that this goes, the only bummer about it is the fact that they get interrupted. Chrestomanci came in wearing a flowered silk dressing gown. It was a red and purple dressing gown with gold at the neck and sleeves. It made Chrestomanci look amazingly tall, amazingly thin, and astonishingly stately. He could have been an emperor or a particularly severe bishop. He was smiling as he came in, but the smile vanished when he saw the jug. The jug tried to vanish too. It fled back to the table at the sight of him so quickly that cocoa slopped out of it onto Gwendolen's dress, which may or may not have been an accident. Julia and Roger both looked stricken. Julia unknotted her handkerchief as if for dear life. "Well, I was coming in to say good morning," Chrestomanci said, "but I see that it isn't. If you two ever want to eat marmalade again, you'd better do as you're told, and the same goes for all four of you." "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Gwendolen said, as if butter would not have melted in her mouth. "Yes, you were," said Roger. Chrestomanci came to the end of the table and stood looking down on them with his hands in his pockets. "There's one absolute rule in this castle," he said, "which it will pay you all to remember. No witchcraft of any kind is to be practiced by children unless Michael Saunders is here to supervise you. Have you understood, Gwendolen?" "Yes," said Gwendolen. She gripped her lips together and clenched her hands, but she was still shaking with rage. "I refuse to keep such a silly rule." Chrestomanci did not seem to hear that, or to notice how angry she was. He turned to Cat. "Have you understood too, Eric?" "Me?" Cat said in surprise. "Yes, of course." Well, I don't know what to make of any of this. Like, the fact that Gwen is so openly hostile to this guy's kids, when you would think that she would want to, like, ingratiate herself, just goes to show the kind of confidence that she has, that she does not need anybody else. Like, she's not trying to network. She is fully prepared to do it all on her own because she thinks she's that good and doesn't really need to have allies in any way. Then when they go to lessons, she thinks that they're going to be taught magic. And it turns out that they're going to be taught ordinary lessons, and she's assigned, like, math to do. And I don't know what, like, this is such a great moment in terms of what you think when you're reading, like, the Harry Potter books, and everybody's taught Transfiguration and Defense Against the Dark Arts and potions, but nobody's taught how to read or math or, you know, like, any basic shit. And Gwendolyn is so disgusted at the fact that she's, like, she says, but I'm terribly talented. I have to go on with it. Your talents will keep, said Mr. Saunders. You can take up witchcraft again when you've learned something else. Open your arithmetic book and do me the first 4 exercises. Eric, I think I'll set you going on some history. Write me an essay on the reign of King Canute. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. But Cat is really struggling because he's left-handed and he has always been punished for writing left-handed. And those of you who may not be aware, this is a real thing that used to happen. Kids that wrote with their left hand were punished, and they would literally like have their left hand cuffed to the desk so that they couldn't use it and were forced to write with their right hand. Just the kind of like backwards barbaric practice. And so he's writing with his left when he can, when the teacher's back is turned, but writes with his right when the teacher's facing him. And the teacher finally notices, like, it's just kind of like what are you doing over here? And Mr. Saunders loses it and then says, then why the black gentleman don't you write with your left hand, boy? They punish me if I do, Cat faltered, very shaken and very perplexed to find Mr. Saunders was angry for such a peculiar reason. Then they deserve to be tied up in knots and roasted, roared Mr. Saunders, whoever they are. You're doing yourself untold harm by obeying them, boy. If I catch you writing with your right hand again, you'll be in really serious trouble. Okay. I'm going to put forth a tiny little theory here that maybe Cat does have magic, but little things like being forced to write with his right hand instead of his left have, like, stunted him. Is that the word I want, I think? I feel like Cat's got some magic and he just doesn't know about it yet. My other theory is that the reason they got brought to the Chrestomanci's house is not because Gwendolyn is so talented at magic. It's because she's so talented at magic and such a bad person. And Chrestomanci can see it. Because later when he asks her why she isn't allowed to learn magic, he says, because you would misuse it. And she doesn't seem to understand that he's making that assessment not on like, well, you just have to be taught responsibility. He seems to be making that assessment based on her personality. It feels like a real thing. And yeah, I'm just like, yeah, you seem to be annoyed, but I'm afraid it's unavoidable. I told Michael Saunders that he was on no account to teach either of you witchcraft because you were bound to misuse it. But I'll reconsider it in a year or so if you still want to learn. Then he smiled kindly at Gwendolyn, obviously expecting her to be pleased, and drifted dreamily away down the marble stairs. Well, Gwendolyn pitches a fit, and she's like screaming, and Cat just can't figure out why they're in this huge marble entryway, and she's screaming, and there's no echo at all. He's still just like, what is it with this place? So they decide to like go outside and explore, and he can see these like ruins that seem to be part of like a really awesome garden. And he keeps trying to get to it and he never really can until finally there's like this sort of falling apart staircase that he spots. And everywhere they go, there's a gardener telling them like there's a big apple orchard and she grabs an apple and bites into it and a gardener appears and is like, you're not allowed to pick apples. She's like, fine. And she throws the apple away. Then they stop in a rose garden and she picks a rose and they're like, you're not allowed to pick the roses. And she's like, fine. And she throws the rose on the ground. And then he tries to climb the stairs to this other garden and one of the gardeners appears and is like, that's Chrestomanci's private garden and you do not get to go in there. And he's like, well, what the fuck? It's such a weird series of things. Let's see. I'm getting rather sick of Chrestomanci forbidding things, said Gwendolyn. It's time someone taught him a lesson. What are you going to do? Said Cat. Wait and see, said Gwendolyn, pressing her lips together in her stormiest way. So this is the end of the chapter, of chapter 4. And I gotta be honest that I do not even know what's gonna happen. I'm really into this, though. I'm really, really into it. Like, I don't like Gwen, but her, like, using magic in this wild way is really fun to read about. I like Cat and his like strange struggle, the castle and like what's going on with it. I can't figure out. I feel like maybe there isn't even a castle. Like there's an illusion over everything, but I'm not sure how that would even work. I don't know. But I have got to go because I am behind for my next episode. And thank you very, very much to Patricia. I'm really enjoying that you keep commissioning Diana Wynne Jones specifically because I just enjoy her writing so much. She's so wild. So thank you all very much for listening. Hope you're enjoying my coverage of it. Thank you again to Patricia. And hopefully I will be seeing you all soon with another 50 pages. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.